What's up, y'all? Brandon here from Order Within. Today's episode is going to be a deep, enlightening conversation around narcissism, what narcissism looks like, the different types of narcissism, and the ways that we can recover and heal from narcissistic abuse. The concept of narcissism is well known, but the common components of it and how frequently it shows up in our lives is not as much discussed as it should be. And our guest, Chelsea Brooke Cole, is a therapist who focuses specifically on narcissistic abuse and how to heal from that trauma. So you'll find a lot of enlightening tips, strategies, and things to consider when dealing with narcissistic relationships and a very narcissistic society that we find ourselves in. So with that being said, let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to Order Within, navigating a world of endless chaos and crisis. Many of us are experiencing inner turmoil, insecurity, anxiety, fears, and isolation. These feelings are only being amplified by news cycles, social media, and never-ending political madness. How do we find our way out of the chaos? How do we find strength within ourselves? How do we find meaning in a world driven by materialism? These questions and many more I aim to answer on the show. My goal is to be a trusted guide on your journey to selfhood. May you find what you seek. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm your host, Brandon Ward, back with another episode of Order Within. We've got a fantastic guest today. Chelsea Brooke Cole is a licensed psychotherapist, certified partner trauma therapist, coach, and speaker specializing in narcissistic abuse and relational trauma. She is the best-selling author of If Only I'd Known: How to Outsmart Narcissists, Set Guilt-Free Boundaries, and Create Unshakable Self-Worth. Chelsea's content provides support to thousands of narcissistic abuse survivors each day through her thriving online community. You can learn more about working with Chelsea or her resources at chelseybrookecole.com. And at the end of the show, we'll have all that stuff in the show notes for y'all as you're listening. And I know that Chelsea will share a little bit more about her work and how she helps specifically for narcissistic abuse survivors. But
Thank
Chelsea,
you. I've been really
welcome.
looking forward to this conversation because we are going to get into a lot of fun topics.
Me too. I was just telling you before we hopped on, I'm super close to finishing your book. I've been really enjoying it. There's a lot of, I think one of the things that stands out most to me initially, Chelsea, is just there's a lot of misperception around narcissism. And I think when we think about narcissism, often people imagine the kind of grandiose, very ego-centered, robust, kind of external or extroverted narcissist. But that's actually a very small slither from what I'm learning. And your book has highlighted a lot of challenges that I've faced in relationships and family throughout my life because of that. So the misperceptions, like what it's big, isn't it, in
Yeah,
our
the grandiose
society?
narcissist is what most people think of when they hear the term narcissist. And as you were saying, they tend to be extroverted, charming, charismatic, arrogant. They have that kind of energy where some people you're drawn to them. You kind of want to be around them because of their charm and charisma. They tend to be very socially adept. If you're a little bit more like highly sensitive, you may be turned off by their larger than life presentation. But overall, they're the people kind of narcissists. Like you said, they're extroverted, they're charming, and so they will draw people in. So those can be sometimes a little bit easier to spot, especially if they're just obviously arrogant or, brash or over the top. But yeah, like in my book, I talk about 6 types of narcissists. The one I think we overlook the most is called a vulnerable narcissist. It's usually referred to as a covert narcissist, and it's just referred to that way because their narcissism is more hidden. And so the vulnerable narcissist draws you in by gaining your sympathy, your pity, your attention, your help, your resources, but they're just as entitled as the grandiose narcissist. Their entitlement just looks a little bit different. A grandiose narcissist entitlement is like, world, look how great I am. They walk into a room and, their presence and their energy is there before they are. But a vulnerable narcissist can look very down, depressed, withdrawn. They tend to be more introverted, not as social, more anxious, or they can actually look, quite sullen and withdrawn or very nice at times. Sometimes they can come across as just like super nice. I know for me, some of the narcissists I've dealt with, the vulnerable narcissist that I was with seemed really nice at first, like it was a breath of fresh air. But over time, I started to see the entitlement coming out.
And that's what I think is interesting is you're highlighting it there. It's deceptive in the sense that you don't even realize
Mhm,
you're engaging with a narcissist. And I think, and to be honest, Chelsea, I saw points in myself where I was a vulnerable
mhm,
narcissist. I was wounded. I had not yet healed. And I was using the people around me to get the attention and the
mhm.
validation that I needed. And I was needy. I knew that I was taking from individuals, friends, relationships, partners. And so it was an interesting thing for me to realize, one, how
Yeah,
much progress I've made, and recognizing that narcissism
mhm,
is also a scale. I think we have these big ideas, as we were talking about at the top of the show, that narcissism is this grandiose component, but there's all of us have components of narcissism in some way, right? I think like maybe a little bit, maybe not all of us, but there's a
mhm.
scale of it that we can, and depending on the environment you grew up in. And I think that's what really for me, growing up in the home that I did, I learned a lot of these behaviors and I didn't know what was healthy.
Yeah,
And that was one of the things that I was reading in your book is, and I know that's later in the book, but is not knowing what is
mhm,
healthy or not. And I think it's understanding that these things can
mhm.
manifest in many ways. And one of the things that I love about your work is trusting yourself, learning to lean into who you are and trusting yourself. But anyway, I don't want to get ahead because the way the structure of your book is
Mhm.
broken into three parts, I think it's great. You focus on the traits of narcissism, the types of narcissism or narcissist, but then you move through, working on yourself, healing, and then understanding the dynamic.
Yeah.
Where do you go from there? And so it's you gotta see it first, right? And this is where we are, I think, in our conversation is recognizing some of
Yeah.
these things. So
Well, I
in
would
Go
love
ahead.
to touch on the part where we all have narcissistic traits because I think that's actually something that's a common misconception when people start to hear this. And I don't know about for you in your case, but I know a lot of people look at it and say, "Well, I've been entitled sometimes," or I've kind of been in a point in my life where I needed that external validation, and I really should have been, providing that more for myself or had more character or integrity in that situation." So yes, narcissism is a personality trait that exists on a spectrum. So you can be a little narcissistic to highly narcissistic, but it's those predictable patterns of behavior over time. So you wouldn't call someone an introvert just because they
Mm,
decided to stay in once on a Friday night. You can't call someone a narcissist just because they acted defensively once in the last 6 months. And so I think that's where people get a little bit hung up. It's
mm,
like narcissists are the ones you consistently have difficulty with. They are consistently high conflict, rigid in their thinking, antagonistic, victimized, vindictive, entitled, emotionally dysregulated. So it's not like a one off or a time or a season in your life where maybe you're going through something and you're a little bit, quote, more needy or seeking validation during that time. That doesn't just make you a narcissist per se. That means you're going through a period of time where you're acting a bit more selfish and entitled, but a narcissist is someone who's displaying those patterns consistently over time in different environments, and it's pervasive, meaning it's in every area of their life for a considerable amount of time.
mm. Well, I guess putting it like that, the even the example that I shared earlier, these were
Mhm.
points in my life. They weren't. So I think that's a great point to bring up because we could be going through
Yeah.
situations or even challenging situations because a lot of that was prompted
Yep.
by my healing. And I wasn't like my feelings and self wasn't
Mhm.
acknowledged growing up, so I had to learn those things. And to your point, I think there was a period in my life where I was going kind of swinging the other direction to where I was
Mhm.
trying to protect myself, heal myself, and I think that isn't necessarily the undercurrent of someone's behavior over time. That's the more
Yeah.
important thing. Well, and one thing that I thought was really interesting too about your work is the lack of
Mm.
self-reflection and how that contributes to this underlying current of narcissism and the way others treat
Mhm.
ourselves and other people and friends and all of that. And I'd never I'd never thought about that before in the way that you presented it. And I'm like, wow, that was kind of the light bulb moment because you go, wait, okay, I get the lack of self-reflection. Reflection takes
Yeah.
humility, it takes patience, it takes compassion. And those are a lot of
They
things
don't
that
have
narcissists don't
They
typically
don't
have, right?
have, yeah, and that's why some people kinda end up feeling bad for narcissists, and in a way, it is a sad plight, like, They don't self-reflect, they project, meaning they don't take the time to think about how their words and actions are impacting others. So they just project, their issues onto other people, and then so if any of the problems or difficulties or struggles they're having in their life, they don't see the impact their behaviors have had that perhaps have contributed to that. They only see your reaction to them. So they don't self-reflect, they project. So they're like, "No, you're antagonistic and you're selfish and you're being critical." But you're probably, in a spot where you've been reacting to what they're doing, how they've been acting, but they don't see their part in it. I know for me in some of my relationships, like, that was the biggest struggle with the some of the narcissists that I had been in a romantic relationship with, was the lack of self-reflection, because you hit that wall, you hit the ceiling where there's some progress, then there might be some growth. In this particular situation, they were a sex addict as well. So there was, like, maybe some acknowledgement of that or some growth, but then we would hit a point where the narcissistic piece took over, and, like, it prevented any more healing. This particular individual got to a point where they were like,
Mm,
"Nope, I don't want any more help. Like, this is annoying. Stop asking me. Stop checking in on me. I don't want to do this therapy thing anymore. Like, I'm done." And so the narcissism piece just
mm,
really keeps them stuck and keeps them from being able to heal, like you have talked about.
mm. Well, and it seems to come down to that lack of responsibility. And when I think back to my childhood and the things that I had to unwind for myself was taking responsibility, like not taking
Mhm.
responsibility for me. Well, was taking responsibility, but also taking responsibility for the people around me's emotions, their well being, their moods.
Mm.
And that was a part of it with my mom. I love her. We still we have a dynamic that we're working through.
Yeah.
She's trying now as she's gotten older, which is great, and we've gotten closer over the years. But when I was young, that was a challenge. Like I took on a lot of that burden of hers because I
Mm.
was raised by her, and I was very empathetic. And I didn't recognize the responsibility piece that each of us are responsible for our thoughts, our emotions, our
Mm.
feelings. And when we own that responsibility, that's what allows us to meet in the middle and work through our challenges. But what you just said, the ceiling that narcissists run up against is their inability to not only reflect, but then take responsibility for
Right.
their actions, right? Because once they do that, they're now admitting that there's flaws, there's kind of
Mhm.
chinks in their armor, and the whole illusion starts to fall. And that simply is too painful, I think, for them to accept. Is that part of, do you think
Yeah,
that's part of
the
it?
core of narcissism is built around this insecure ego. And so everything that is built off of their personality is to protect that insecure ego. Even the grandiose narcissists, like, truly confident people don't have to put others down. But grandiose narcissists are constantly in that
Mm,
comparison game and seeing the world in a very competitive place. So once you have that insecure ego, but you're not willing to address it, you create all these defense mechanisms, these really rigid protective strategies to protect that inner core. So you can't handle shame. You can't handle that,
mm,
guilt that
mm,
that leads to positive change. Narcissists get stuck in this shame rage cycle where if you're like a mild to moderate narcissist, then you do experience some guilt. Like, you care about the image, you care about how things look, and you really don't like being called out. So, for example, if you're a narcissist and you've cheated on your spouse, like, that that's not a good look. And if your spouse finds out or calls it out, then that narcissist will experience a little bit of shame around that, of like, "Oh, this doesn't look good for me." Not guilt like, "Oh, I did something bad, like, I really feel for this and I need to take a hard look at myself." It's, "Oh, this isn't a good look." Like, no one, wants to look like a cheater, but because they can't handle that shame and move it into something that's productive, they go in the shame rage cycle. Now they turn it around on you. The projection, the blame shifting, "You're so controlling," or "I wouldn't have had to do that if you would have done this." And they make everything about you and how you haven't been there for them or how the relationship hasn't been good. Or they just more than likely deny the whole thing altogether, even if you have proof.
mm. Well, and I'm glad you said that too, Chelsea, because what I've come to realize is so much of this, we have this idea that people narcissists love themselves, they're
Yeah.
obsessed with themselves, but really they're obsessed
Right.
with their image and this idea of who they are. They actually don't have any sense of a
Yeah.
true self because, at least from what I understand, because when you do, when you have that true self, you're
Yeah.
anchored in that. And so if someone comes to me and says, you're a
Mhm.
jerk or you're mean or you're dishonest, I know that that's not who I am because of the way that I operate on a day to day basis, the way that I treat people. I can look at myself and say, actually, that's not true. And to be honest, Chelsea, I've had relationships with narcissists reflecting back where they said
Mhm.
terrible things to me. And as I was going through my journey, I started to recognize, wait a second, just because someone says that to you
Mm.
doesn't mean that it's true or right or they're on point. And I think that's part of it too, is because caring people who want to support and love another person, when someone that they care about tells them, oh, you're mean or your life is stupid or your hobbies are dumb or the way you dress is stupid, like I hate your friends,
Yeah.
and you care about that person, you start to think, well, maybe they are. Maybe I
Mm.
do dress like an idiot, or maybe my hobbies are dumb. But once you start to love yourself and you realize, wait a second, hold up, wait a second.
Mm.
I know this about myself. Is that true? I'm kind to people. I follow through with the things I say. So, but without that strength of self, it's really hard to navigate
Yeah.
situations like that, isn't it?
Yeah, like you said, narcissists are obsessed with their image because they are who their image is. So they don't really have to be good to feel good about themselves. They just have to look good. And if that's where your focus is, what
Mm,
people see, what people think, then all of their energy is focused on what other people think of them, like maintaining if it's a grandiose narcissist, maintaining this very successful, productive, great image. And as long as they're getting feedback from the world that they're being perceived in that way, then they can maintain that grandiose vision of themselves or that image of themselves. And so that's also part of the struggle is because narcissists do put so much effort into their image, whereas a healthy person is actually more concerned about what's going on behind the scenes. Like, yeah, we kind of all care how we're perceived in a way, but for a healthy person, you're concerned that how you come across to others is who you are. Like you want that connection. Like you don't want to be one person at home and another person out and about. Like you want that to match. If you're a kind person at one place, you want to be a kind person in another place. But narcissists genuinely don't care what people don't know. So they're putting so much effort
mm.
into their image that they are able to convince a lot of people that they are the image, that they are nice, kind, successful, caring, unassuming. And then the people who are closest to the narcissist are often the ones that are devalued the most. That's where we get into this, concept of narcissistic abuse and why it's so harmful because the world gets one image, you get the real, version of the narcissist at home where they're critical and contemptuous and belittling, but no one else is seeing that, of course. So then you're even more isolated from being able to explain to people what's going on, A, because you don't know, and B, because even if you did tell other people, they don't see the narcissist in that way.
Which and you're running up against that story, and I think that's why I'm glad we're having this conversation because not enough of us are aware of
Hmm.
the qualities and the way narcissism can manifest in people and the way it can change. I mean, honestly, when you're describing those things, the image component, the lack of self-reflection, I think about politicians
Yeah.
and celebrities and
Yeah.
regardless of what political side you may fall on or none, frankly, I don't associate with any of it anymore. But
Hmm.
you see that and you realize like some of the most narcissistic people I think in our society are also the ones
Yeah.
driving our laws and our culture in Hollywood and politics. And it's very dangerous and toxic. And I think
No.
that's not an accident because they're portraying this image of who they are and in
Yeah.
private, to your point. I mean, you hear about some of these things that happen, but I don't think people realize the level of depravity that exists in our society that's hidden
Hmm.
behind these masks. And that's why learning about these things are so crucial. And to your point earlier, if you're a kind, loving person, the goal is to match who we are both behind
Right.
closed doors and in public as much as we possibly can.
Hmm.
You want that gap to be none so that you're consistent everywhere. That for me is my aim is to be the same that I am everywhere, behind closed doors,
Right.
privately, public, whatever. But that takes effort and it's
Hmm.
good work, right? But man, we're kind of a long way away from a lot of that with the way our
There's a
society
reason,
presents
yeah,
itself.
that we get so much pushback when we talk about narcissism because we kind of live in a narcissistic culture. Like we talk about business or organizations, like you said, or politics. Like we put a lot of emphasis on what things look like. And this is why leaders, we ask people generally, what do you think of when you think of a good leader? Like someone who's charming and can work a room and isn't necessarily the one who's doing the most work, but is the one who looks like they're doing the most work, or who's able to get enough people like on their side or to get support. Or narcissists, especially grandiose narcissists, appear very confident. And, you know, people are drawn to confidence. Like we think that, oh, well, they know what they're doing, or they have good ideas here. So we kind of naturally go that way. And we don't think, well, what about empathy? And what about kindness? And what about compassion? More of those values like you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm certainly pushing to create more of a society in that sense. But the way, in my mind, the way we go about doing that is we lead by example. We
Hmm.
live true to those values. We show people those values. We honor that way of living, which takes time. But we do have an uphill
Yeah.
battle, I think, from that perspective, because it's still kind of crazy to me how people, when you list the characteristics of a leader, they still do
Hmm.
kind of those superficial components, which have been around for a long time. I think something, Chelsea, too, that would be great is when we first initially talked, and you talked about this in your book too, is the MPP, which is can you explore
Oh,
what's that acronym
NPD, like
again?
narcissistic personality disorder. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, yeah, exactly. It's like 6% of the population supposedly, which is
Yes.
roughly
Yeah.
20 million
Which is
ish,
scary to say.
which doesn't seem like a lot,
It's
but it
so
actually is,
many. Yeah.
right?
So a recent study, yeah, showed that NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, has a lifetime prevalence rate of 6%. So according to the US population, that's about 20 million people. If you consider that those 20 million narcissists negatively impact 5 other people throughout their lifetime, which is really a very conservative estimate, then there will be 99 million narcissistic abuse survivors in the US alone. So narcissism really
That's a
it's
third of the
affecting
population.
millions and millions of people all over the world. Like this is an epidemic. This is not a small thing that's happening where honestly, I think we all will know a narcissist at some point in our life. At least one that would cause enough damage. Like you don't have to be diagnosed with NPD to cause damage because like we talked about, narcissism exists on a spectrum. So you may be dealing with someone who's never been diagnosed because that's going to take them going to a mental health professional, actually telling the truth, like getting that diagnosis. So to me, I think it's less relevant the debate of, well, do they meet, criteria for NPD, or we can't call them a narcissist because we can't diagnose. Well, you're not. If you can call someone agreeable, conscientious, extroverted, you can call them narcissistic because narcissism is a personality style and a trait, not a diagnosis.
That's interesting. See, and I think that's why understanding the
Mhm.
different types that you've laid out in your book are helpful too, because like we said at the beginning, we think about narcissism in this one specific way, but
Yeah.
there's a variety of ways that narcissists can manifest themselves. And I think one of the ones that was interesting to me,
Mhm.
first, the vulnerable one is I've absolutely been in relationships with vulnerable narcissists. That was very, I mean, I have people in my family that
Mhm.
reflect that type of narcissism, but the a few of the others, the more
Communal?
social, the like the giving, and I have them written down, and I'm
Was it the
totally
communal narcissist?
exactly. There's a communal, and then there's the other that's also very similar, not communal, but maybe it is the vulnerable. But I think from the traits of giving and being
Yeah. Yeah.
charitable, and which I
Mhm.
think is the communal, isn't it? That's where. But so we don't realize again the image piece to me and the lack of self-reflection are what create this dynamic. And I think the sad thing is the tragedy of it all is it's built around that there's no true connection to who they really are. There's no true self, which is where this comes from. And so the narcissistic supply
Yeah.
that they need to get from the world, that's why these types are so prevalent. So could we talk a little bit
Yeah.
about those 6
Yeah,
types,
for
Chelsea, if
sure.
that's okay?
So we talked about the grandiose, that typical narcissist we think of, the vulnerable that can appear very sad and sullen or very nice, but is equally antagonistic and entitled. There's the communal that you were touching on. These are the humanitarians, philanthropists, and do gooders of the world. They want to be seen as endlessly giving, self sacrificial. Like, this is the mom who's at every bake sale, every fundraiser, every school event, but at home is critical and contemptuous to her kids. It's the leader of the nonprofit who you think just does all this good work and is so amazing, or they're posting these movie star quality selfies of their Saturday morning volunteering at the local soup kitchen or volunteering at the animal shelter. But at home or with those closest to them, they're just as antagonistic and critical because even though these things are good, they're not giving their efforts to these causes for the sake of doing good. They're doing it for the validation and attention they expect to receive because of it. And if they don't get that, then they will be sullen, withdrawn, and lash out at those closest to them. So they're only, doing these things if they can do it in front of a group of people and get that validation and recognition that, oh, you're such a giving, kind person, or if they can document it and share it later.
And Chelsea, that's the narcissistic supply
Hmm.
component that you identified in the book that was also a new concept to me is that validation, that perspective, that image that they're showing the world. That is the supply that a narcissist needs to gain to make them feel good
Right.
about who they are, right? So that's why they do that. Not because of good, they want to do good, but because they want to appear
Right.
to
Yeah.
be
I kind of
virtuous.
like parallel narcissistic supply and a healthy person's self esteem. Like we're talking about, healthy people want to build self-esteem by having their words and actions match, by being who they say they are, like so that they're a consistent person in every place. Narcissists don't so much care how they look in different environments, if who they are at home is who they are outside. They just care that they're seen in a particular way. And then the different narcissistic types kind of look for supply a little bit differently. The communal narcissists want to be viewed as that endlessly giving, self-sacrificial kind of person. And as long as they're getting that attention and validation from other people, like, yes, you're so giving and you're so charitable. And it's like they draw people in because people often feel lucky to be with them romantically or to be around them because you think, oh, I'm just around this person who's so good and so giving and so involved in this charitable work or in their community. And, you know, people often feel lucky, like, to be around them. And so for the communal narcissist, that's the narcissistic supply they're looking for.
See, and I love that you said that because I've interacted with people like I lived in California for almost a decade, and like there are a lot of people in California that reflect that. I had a guest on early on, Andrew Daniel. He does coaching work, similar work. He called that the
Mm,
spiritualized ego, where it's basically you're it's a similar thing, but you're presenting this very spiritualized, giving
yeah.
personality to the world. Another one, the other one that I was thinking of too, which I had not recognized was the
Ah,
self-righteous
yes.
narcissist, and that is another one very prevalent in California, but is was one that for me helped a lot recognizing, I think, some of the people and
Mhm,
relationships that I've had in my life, not necessarily romantic ones, but
mhm.
people that I've struggled with. And honestly, Chelsea, I've interacted with people lately and I'm like, I couldn't figure out I'll talk to somebody and then I'll feel, I'm like, "What? I just talked to this person for an hour and I can't even put what
Yeah.
happened?" And that's we'll talk a little bit about that because I think that's important because I wanna get into not honestly, not just identifying them, but
Mhm,
recognizing the symptoms in ourself, the
mhm.
signs in ourself. But so let's talk a little bit if we can about the self-righteous narcissist and get through a
Yeah.
few more of the
Yeah, so the
personality types if we
self-righteous
can.
narcissist is really rigid, controlling, hyper moralistic. They, do care a lot about what other people think. They tend to be very active in religious spaces, nonprofit organizations, because those places allow them to espouse their hypocritical views in politically correct ways. They really get their narcissistic supply from being seen as just so put together, so organized. And they become hyper focused on perfecting kind of obsessively on whatever it is that they think is the most important thing, whether it's their fitness, what they look like, how, clean they keep their house or how their towels are organized, whatever it is, they become, fixated on that and they want to get the validation from people that they are being seen in just such a they're so organized, they're so on time, they're so whatever great in that particular area. And when you're dealing with a self-righteous narcissist, you end up feeling like you're living in a glass box. Like, you feel so self-conscious
Mm,
being around them because they constantly have this kind of like they're looking down on anything that doesn't match their standard. And so you feel particularly
that's it.
criticized. You do around any narcissist, but for these types especially, literally can never measure up. And just the amount of hypervigilance and self-consciousness that you feel in these relationships because you know they're judging, critiquing everything you do, what you wear, how you look. I've had some experiences with these types of narcissists as well in romantic relationships, and it's so awful on your self-esteem as a partner because they're literally judging everything you do, like every move you make, every angle and everything that you look like. At least for me, that's what my self-righteous narcissist was focused on, was outward appearance, and so, literally, I felt like I just needed to almost be like a mannequin, like, I didn't need to move too much, like, I was so hyper aware of how I looked in every angle, and it was exhausting and it was awful because that is not me, but that's how you feel dealing with these types.
And that's where the discombobulation of
Yeah.
yourself happens over time. Like it erodes away at yourself. Just what you were describing, you're now on
Mhm.
edge 24/7, mindful of how you're presenting yourself, mindful of the way you're
Mhm.
talking, mindful of the way you look, mindful of the things you say. And the thing is they'll never say something publicly. If they do, it's
Yeah,
that passive
subtle. Mhm.
aggressive, backhanded comments. But then when you get home, you get
Mhm.
grilled on how stupid you are. Why would you make us look this way? You look foolish. I look foolish. It's always, and I think it's important to note too, is it comes back to them and the way that
Yeah.
they are feeling. We internalize these things, which is it's easy for
Yeah.
caring, loving people to do. When you're honest, you want to take what they say as oh, okay, again, maybe I'm doing this, maybe I am this or that. But I think it's so important, Chelsea, and this is what I appreciate about your work is our feelings, we know. When you're in a loving relationship, a healthy relationship, you say this. You don't have to question it. You know that somebody's there for you. You get a sense of them being there for you
Yeah.
when you need them and they have your back. They follow through with the things they say. So if you've been in a relationship and you're constantly second guessing yourself, that's probably an indicator
It's
that
a
something's
problem,
off,
yeah.
right?
The first red flag we're usually consciously aware of in a toxic or narcissistic relationship is changes in your thinking. Stuff starts just not adding up. You are giving way more mental and emotional energy to trying to figure out this person or this relationship than anything else. You end up doing a lot of rumination. And I think rumination gets a bad rap because it takes so much of our energy and it can cause a lot of anxiety. But we ruminate for a reason. You ruminate because things don't make sense. And that's why I'm a big believer in having a different view on triggers instead of disliking triggers or like rumination or anxiety. Like triggers validate your reality. They prove what you went through was real because you wouldn't ruminate if it weren't confusing. You wouldn't feel hypervigilant if you weren't around someone harmful. And so, yeah, a lot of the cognitive dissonance, like the fact that this person's words and actions don't match up, like that adds to a lot of the rumination that ends up happening. For example, if you're married to someone, like you're saying, you expect to be able to rely on, communicate with, receive love and support from them. But when you're married to someone and your spouse is critical or contemptuous or makes you question your reality all the time, like getting into that gaslighting, then we're uncomfortable with the anxiety that arises from that mismatch between our expectations and reality. So then we start justifying or rationalizing this person's bad or difficult behaviors, thinking things like they probably didn't mean it. They're just really stressed at work. They had a bad day. So you'll say something like, yeah, I'm married to someone, but they don't really mean it. And so you're making those excuses to try to deal with the confusion that is happening. So that's usually the first sign you're aware of that something in this relationship is not right.
See, that's great. And that's and we're going to dive a little deeper into the
Hmm.
different signals too that come up because I think that's very important to recognize. And I love that. I don't think I don't love it. I love it in the
Yeah.
sense it's important to recognize these pieces. That's the thing. But it's tough because caring people will a lot of times, particularly if they come from abusive backgrounds or neglectful backgrounds, they'll
Just,
just dismiss those feelings because that's what they've learned. That's become normal. But there's two more types of
yeah.
narcissists before we move forward, and that's the neglectful narcissist
Hmm.
and the malignant narcissist. Right? I think we've covered the
Yeah,
other
so
four
I'll
so
start with
far.
the malignant narcissist. When you think about that spectrum of narcissism, they're all the way on the high end. They are like a cousin to the psychopath. The malignant narcissist is said to be the pinnacle of the dark triad, the point at which Narcissism, psychopathy, and
Mm,
Machiavellianism, which is that singular focus on power, all collide. So they are sadistic, very controlling. They can come across as like a bit like grandiose narcissists at first because they do tend to be quite charming and charismatic, but they have a more intense and sinister feel to them. And their narcissistic supply not only comes from controlling you, but they actually take pleasure in your pain because they see, your pain as proof of their power. Like I'm able to hurt you. I'm able to have
mm,
control over you. They are focused on dominance and superiority or being superior over someone else. And so they're the scary ones. They're the ones who are the CEOs have been embezzling millions with no regard for who it's, negatively impacting. They're the spouse who fights for custody of the kids, not because they care about the kids, but literally just to hurt you because they know that that will harm you. Or the serial cheaters who just have no regard for the impact this is having on you. And so these are the ones that people are kind of scared of. Like they really aren't sure if they leave this relationship, what this person will do. Because malignant narcissists can also be quite kind of obsessive and controlling. They can track people. They they use a lot of coercive control tactics like intimidation, threats, humiliation. Kind of like they let you know that they know where you are and what you're doing and you don't know how or why. So there's those subtle threats where you're like, how did they know I had that conversation? How did they know where I was? And they don't tell you. And so you really start to wonder, how far will this person go if I leave? So they can be very scary.
Chelsea, actually had a friend in college. My buddy and I had a friend in college that
Ooh.
was just like that. Very like on the border. Like we were friends, but then things started getting weird and we
Yeah.
started setting boundaries. And then over time, he started sending these weird text messages and calls about seeing where we were and looking in our
Mm,
cars. And it really gives you this sense of
yeah.
like, this is unsafe. Like, it was honestly, it was more my buddy that
Hmm.
he was doing this for because they were, not closer, but they had more of the relationship. So but anyway, my point is it
Yeah.
can get dangerous if you're not careful, and that's I think the malignant narcissist is also the
Yeah.
dictators and the large kind of that type of
They
personality,
can be
right? Like, when we think of
surgeons.
that. But it
Yeah.
can manifest in
Yeah, I
small
was gonna say
ways.
they can
Oh,
be
sorry,
like
go
the
ahead.
surgeons. They can make they can be good in certain situations, like well, I don't say good, but they do handle stressful situations quite well. Like their nervous system is a bit different. Like they just don't have the same. They don't respond to stress or fear in the same way that other people do.
It's yeah, and I think it's funny because I know I get the sense of a surgeon can be that skill set to not be
Right.
as responsive to stress can be a good thing, but it can
Very
also go
much.
awry very quickly if they're not reflective. And I think for me, something that's been is the reflective component. The counter to narcissism in so many ways is
Mhm.
self-reflection, learning about ourselves, trusting ourselves, and learning to do more of that, which we're gonna get into a bit here. But the last one though, which I didn't realize the neglectful narcissist and much of my experience growing up
Mm.
was a lot of that. It was the I mean, full on neglect. It was basically your emotions and
Yeah.
needs are a burden, and therefore I'm just going to basically discard
Mhm.
you in a lot of ways. And so, but I'd love to hear your perspective on a
Yeah, I definitely
neglectful
wanted to include
narcissist.
the neglectful narcissist in my book because it's one that's overlooked. It has the most understated, like love bomb or idealized phase in that narcissistic cycle of abuse. Like they don't do a lot to get you into the relationship. If it's an adult relationship, you tend to get with a neglectful narcissist because it makes sense. They like follow the same religion that you're looking for, that's important in your family, kind of for practical reasons. But those who are in romantic relationships with a neglectful narcissist don't feel like they had a love bombing phase, an idealized phase. It's very understated. And so that's the type of narcissist that's really overlooked because it has all the same core traits: grandiosity, entitlement, superficiality, but there's not that charm or charisma. At home, interestingly, I can totally relate to that because my dad is more of a neglectful narcissist. There was just that emotional coldness, neglect, like there wasn't a lot of anything there. When you're with these kind of people, you feel like you're a ghost. You feel invisible over time. Like, yeah, you're in the house, but it's like an ongoing silent treatment. it's emotionally neglectful. There's just nothing there. Like, you don't get to have the fight, you don't get to have the discussion. They just really completely overlook you. And so that can be particularly painful
Okay.
in its own way because you don't understand why there's just nothing there. You feel very hollow when you're around those kind of people.
It's honestly, I know we just talked about malignant narcissists and their sadistic nature and how bad it can be, but neglectful narcissism in a lot of ways is it's
Mhm.
deeply cruel with when you factor in the silent treatment, the disc, just like you
Mhm.
said, the ghost component. I mean, honestly, I'm learning about my wife and things that she's experienced and the relationships that she's had growing up. She grew up in California. There was just this that disconnect, that
Mm.
silent treatment component, silent treatment is
So painful.
cruel because at least when you fight, you know what's happening and
Mhm.
there's like a response. But silent treatment could be anything and you have no idea. And then if you care, you internalize it. And that's so much what happens. We blame ourselves. We think that we're wrong. I'm a burden. I'm too much. I'm all of these things
Yeah.
we justify, right? We go in this justification cycle.
It
It's
is,
very
and
sad.
because that person is not acknowledging you at all, you feel that having needs isn't even safe. Like, having your own emotions isn't even safe. It's not even okay. So you do disconnect from your own sense of self, like your own thoughts, your own feelings, because you learn that they're irrelevant essentially in that kind of relationship. And so all of your attention goes to this other person, like outside of yourself. What's the emotional temperature of the room? What do they need from me? And you slowly over time just disconnect more and more from yourself because it's not even safe to like explore your own thoughts and feelings. And you don't even feel like that's an option if you're a child growing up in this situation. You just know that my feelings and needs are irrelevant. I'm here for what this other person needs from me.
That I when I learned that, I read Alice
Mhm.
Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child, and that's effectively what she describes is dealing with kind of the neglectful component of things and not even realizing that having feelings is a thing
Yeah.
that normal and healthy people do. Like that you're even like to have thoughts and feelings of your
Yeah.
own is actually okay. It's wonderful. And I think it's great too what you mentioned earlier, and then we can get into well, I love the piece that you talked about cognitive
Mhm.
versus affective empathy, so we can touch on that in a s I have so many notes, Chelsea, from your book, it's crazy. I wanna get because 'cause I'm just trying to make sure we get through as much as we can in the from your book here. But the because that's interesting again to me, the cognitive
Mhm.
versus affective empathy, and really, again, but it's more about presentation, it seems to me, like the
Mhm.
presentation of empathy, and they've cognitive empathy is basically learning what empathy looks like, right? And then displaying it versus affective empathy is actually
Yeah,
caring
that's where
about people.
no, you're right.
Or am I
Yeah,
flipping it?
some people get confused, especially with like the communal narcissists or the ones who do appear giving and who do seem to care about outside influences like world hunger or nonprofits or being involved in their church or community. So if you're in that relationship with that person, that narcissist, you really get confused because you think, but they do care about these different things. Like, they volunteer at the animal shelter or they care about this, nonprofit thing that's going on in the community. But there's a difference between cognitive and affective empathy. So, cognitive empathy is being able to intellectually understand things you should care about or problems people have, and kind of like from a distance. You're like, "Oh, that's sad." Cognitive empathy is just having the intellectual ability to go, "Oh, that must be a difficult situation." But you're not really emotionally attached to it. Affective empathy is what we're really usually meaning when we say empathy. You have a genuine feeling for that person. You can imagine what it would be like to be in that situation, and you feel sad, like you feel connected, and your heart kind of hurts for what that other person is going through or for that situation. So just because a narcissist looks like they care about something else or even looks like they care about friends, sometimes my clients will be like, they're so good to their friends, but they're awful to me as the spouse. And I'm like, yeah, but for their friends, they get to look like the hero. Like, their friends need something, and the narcissist is like, "I'll call you," or "I'll be there," or "I'll pick you up." They're getting supply from that. It's not like that person is really requiring emotional depth or intimacy or consistency from them like a partner would. So even in that, I found it to be like, just because they look like they care about something, you also have to ask, what are they gaining from that? What are they benefiting from it? Because that's a big difference between actually having affective empathy towards something.
And I think the narcissistic supply component is so important to recognize and learn about because when you start to understand that they lack an internal supply, which is what happens when we have
Hmm.
a healthy connection to who we are, we have self-esteem, we have confidence. This is what I built over time with myself is an
Right.
internal supply. It used to be external, right? And you get all that but that's the healthy piece. But once you start to realize
Hmm.
that that's the disconnect is that a narcissist needs that supply to come from everyone else, you can start to make sense of why they're
Yeah.
kind to their friends or doing the things that they're doing because it's not
Mm.
really even about their friends. It's just about getting
Right.
what they need. And that's the danger of it because it can be confusing. And I think this is a great segue
Hmm.
into the cycle of abuse that narcissists typically perpetuate in their relationships because the first
Hmm.
state is idolized, right? Which is also known as love bombing. And I think that's an example of helping your friends is an idealistic way
Yeah.
that they're using that, right? Or am I getting a
Yeah,
little
that could
little mixed
totally
up there with
happen.
that?
So, the narcissistic cycle of abuse, just to take a wide angle view first, is idealize, devalue, discard, hoover. So, in that idealize, that love bombing phase, let's say it's a romantic partner, this is when the infatuation happens, there's intensity, the relationship often moves really quickly. You feel that, you're spending all your time together. You've moved in together quite quickly. Like there's an intensity usually to narcissistic love bombing. And then as soon as you kind of get in that state and you think, "Oh, I'm getting to know this person, we're creating memories, we're making plans for our life, like I think this is my soulmate, I'm so glad I met them." Then that's when the devalue starts to happen. They start to pull back. Things go from hot to cold and you're like, "What happened here? Like what is this change?" And then you try desperately to get it back and thinking, "Oh, well maybe we need to spend more time together or maybe they got distracted with something else." Or so you try really hard to get their attention back. You feel like all their attention was on you and then all of a sudden it got taken somewhere else. And so then you start trying really hard to get that back. You do more, you give more, you're more patient, all the while the narcissist is devaluing you at this point. They're criticizing you more. They're not showing up. They're being inconsistent. You're starting to realize that, oh, this life I thought we were building together and what was happening or what we were going to be together, it's not happening. So that's where all that cognitive dissonance and confusion starts to come in. And then there's the discard, and that can happen in a couple different ways. Some narcissists emotionally discard you, so they'll stay in the relationship, but they'll act in ways that are highly disrespectful to emotionally discard you. Cheating on you multiple times, betraying you, lying to you, making decisions that impact you, but not discussing it with you, like taking a job where you have to move somewhere else and not discussing it with you, or they could physically discard by leaving the relationship. And finally, the Hoover stage is has a couple different options as well. Some narcissists will Hoover and try to essentially that's love bombing 2.0. They try to get you back in the relationship or they try to keep open communication with you even if they have a new partner because knowing that you'll talk to them is a source of narcissistic supply. Like, "Oh, my ex still talks to me even though I'm in this new relationship." Like they kind of like to collect supply. So they may be hoovering you that way. Some narcissists don't hoover, and that may be because they go off on a new relationship and they're just completely distracted with it. And that cycle is from beginning to end of the relationship, but it also happens throughout the relationship. Like it can literally happen within a day, week, or month. And I think that's a really important point for people to get is you can have a great day together on Saturday, be disrespected and devalued on Sunday, then you are discarded on Monday because they won't talk to you. They're giving you the silent treatment. And Tuesday, you're brought flowers, and then they say sorry. And like, it is so confusing how quickly it can go from hot to cold, and you don't know why, and you don't know how to make it stop, and you don't know what's happening. That's part of why these relationships are so damaging.
It's wild. And Chelsea, I've been in relationships where that cycle has
Yeah.
happened in the same day. You go out and you have a great dinner, 2 hours with some friends, and then you're in the Uber ride to the next spot,
Yeah.
and it all goes to hell, and you get there, and then you're all through this but because it's important to recognize that that is a cycle, not just this over the
Right.
period of a relationship that can happen a variety of ways. And as I was learning and reading your book, I'm like, man, I wish I had known this many years ago because that's why it's important to recognize these things because
Yes.
patterns, you start to see patterns and it's the hoovering. I assume you call it hoovering
That's
because
it.
basically they're trying
That's
to
where it
suck
came
you
from.
back
Yep.
into the relationship. That's, yeah. Cause,
Yeah.
and that's what it feels like. There's the love bombing. And it's interesting, Chelsea, when I was younger, I would do that in relationships. I
Mhm.
would actually love bomb and I didn't know that I was
Right.
doing this again, and the level of the scale component is there, but this is why reflection is so important. We can see our shortcomings and I learned that was me doing the nice guy thing, presenting an idea of
Mhm.
what I thought women wanted in relationships. I had to learn that that's not the case. It wasn't until I started embracing who I truly was, I started presenting all of what I am, and I started to let the
Mhm.
cards fall where they may. If you don't like my sensitivity or the way that I share, then that's not a good fit instead of trying to
Yeah.
change ourselves. So it really does come back to connecting with who we truly are, living authentic to who we are and honoring ourselves from within,
Mhm.
doesn't it?
Yeah, and in that situation, I think and this could be a whole nother topic, honestly, but our nervous systems get used to being in relationships in certain ways. So if you grew up in a house that's chaotic or neglectful or dysfunctional in some way, then you get used to the hot and cold. And then you think that's how the relationships are supposed to go. And not that you're being narcissistic or a narcissist, but you're used to that hot and cold. I'll say, like for me, it felt very familiar to me to have to try to prove myself and to try to be good enough in relationships. So I was not, the one that was creating this love bombing or the narcissistic cycle of abuse with the narcissist I was with, but I my nervous system was used to that because I had not had really healthy romantic relationships at that point. So when I started dating, I was very used to having a few good times, but then a problem would happen and we'd have to work on the problem. We'd have to work really hard on the problem. We'd have to talk about it. We had to talk about it some more. And I would have to try to be better and I'd have to try to get them to see something. Like I always thought we're just one insight away from making all of this work. And there's an
Mhm.
endless amount of information. And I've always been me. And I've always been like, I'll read, I'll do the things. I mean, obviously, I'm a therapist. So I was all into the personal development. So I thought, we can figure this out. We can make this work. And so then it would get a little bit better. But then the problems would seep in again. Like there would be more betrayals. I would find out about the things they weren't telling me, inconsistencies. Then I would address it again and think, okay, it's good now. We're good. But then, good for a little bit, something would happen again. And so, you kind of have to wonder too, like, and that's why in my book I talk about what environment did you grow up in? Because if you grew up in a kind of chaotic, dysfunctional, environment, then you're used to what a narcissistic relationship feels like, the hot and cold, the up and down. And so you actually have to learn how to regulate yourself in a healthy way so that you can then attract and get into and feel more comfortable in healthy relationships yourself.
And that's exactly what I ended up doing, and I really appreciate you sharing it that way, 'cause I know that there are people out there that
Mhm.
can relate to that experience to where they grew up in a certain type of environment with their family. They didn't realize that it was toxic or
Right.
unhealthy and out of balance, and you have to learn these behaviors because you talk about
Mhm.
that too, mirroring. If we don't have healthy mirroring from our parents or parental, the adults in our life, we are going to
Yeah.
learn unhealthy things, and that's ultimately we go on and repeat those cycles. And so that's why this work is so important too, is we break the cycle of abuse when we see what's happening and then we learn these behaviors differently and we make the changes in our life. That's the power of it. But it's it's so this being caught in these cycles and it's such
Mhm.
a common thing. It's because Chelsea, you said it. I did a whole episode on our narcissistic
Mhm.
society. Like when you look at our culture, it's pretty damn narcissistic. And so you're countering our culture in a lot of ways by learning these things, which is important. But you don't know that because you look around and you're like, well, I mean, this is kind of
Yeah.
what everything is. So, but I think this is why pivoting into part two, and I know we're not going to get into, yeah, I'd love to get into part three, but we're already almost an hour in and we're just getting into part two because finding yourself and this is what I appreciated about too. I appreciate a lot of the work that you've done, but the piece of recognizing your own feelings,
Yes.
your thoughts, and if you're feeling cloudy or up in the air or confused and there's inconsistency in someone's words and there's actions,
Mhm.
those are red flags. You gotta trust yourself, right? So I'd love to kinda get your perspective on that too, and what that means for us to start picking up the
Mm.
pieces, if you will.
Yeah, that part 2 in my book is all about finding yourself, and a huge part of that is learning to identify your thoughts and feelings because like you've talked about, for so long, you may have never thought about, "What do I think and what do I feel?" And if you're in a narcissistic relationship, all of your mental and emotional resources are going to understanding this other person, which is important. You do have to understand narcissism because what they do is so crazy, you feel crazy for explaining it. So there has to be a point at which you're like, "Oh, okay, I see that, I get that." But that's not all because you have to figure out, well, how like, who am I? Because after these relationships or during them, you realize that you completely disconnected from yourself. And so that's the process that like, you know, kind of take people through in the book is slowing down. I do that a lot. I encourage clients to do that a lot by just checking in with yourself, like literally being intentional throughout the day to stop and say, "Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Have I eaten anything? Have I, gotten up and like went outside? How do I feel right now? What temperature do I like it in my house? Do I like this song or this song? Do I prefer eating breakfast or not?" Like these typical things that healthy people take for granted that they know. Like, of course, you know how you feel or what you like or what you don't like. No, you don't. Especially if you've been in a narcissistic relationship or
Mhm.
environment, you don't know any of those things. So, literally, like setting reminders on your phone, putting sticky notes up around your house to check in to say, "How do I feel? What do I need?" And writing those things down. And over time, you'll start to see a pattern in yourself of how you typically feel, what you typically need, in what environments do you feel energized versus in what environments do you feel drained? So it is building that self relationship, figuring out who you are, and then going from there.
Well, and I love your approach because I think sometimes when we're in very toxic situations or we're feeling the despair that can come from being in a very dark place, we just wanna get through the
Yeah.
healing and feel okay. We just wanna plow through it, right? But
No.
this doesn't work that way. It really is it's a change in behavior. And so your approach that you describe in your book is start small and slow.
Yeah.
Just eat the things that you just described. Do I like this song? Do I not? What temperature do I like the home to be? Do I like cotton sheets or
Right.
do I want Egyptian sheets? Like those things, all that little stuff matters because when I started to learn to parent
Hmm.
myself, because that's exactly what that is. You're parenting yourself. You're learning to be there for you, your emotional needs, your mental needs, your physical needs. And that's a process. Because if you've spent your entire life not knowing anything about who you truly are, you're not going to
No.
learn it in 48 hours. So, I think the scary thing is, and I'm sure you get this a lot with clients, is we don't realize the joy that can come from reconnecting with ourself and learning about who we are and because you get to experience yourself in a way that you never have and you start to realize, wait a second, I'm actually
Yeah.
pretty dang cool and I've got some good stuff to offer the world. And so I think like I'd love to hear from your perspective, Chelsea, on that and how you work with your clients if they're kind of struggling with this concept of rebuilding
Hmm.
a relationship with
And
yourself.
exactly like you said, people may go their whole life and not realize who they are. So this may be the first time that you really start to slow down and think, who am I and what do I need? And yes, that's one thing that I really appreciate about my work with clients is that I'm able to be on the outside and I see so much good in my clients, like their strengths and their compassion and their self-reflection. And I I just feel honored to be able to help them see that in themselves, like to be that healthy mirror, to say, "I see this in you. Like you really are good. You really did try. You really are compassionate." And once you can start to take care of yourself, then yeah, you do end up developing more self worth, a stronger sense of self, because now you can say, "I know who I am and I know what I like and what I don't like." And that may give you the strength to either leave the toxic relationship or at least set boundaries. That's the most important thing and part, like piece of healing, is that you learn to take back your mind. You learn to take back your mental real estate to know how you feel, to know what you think so that even if you have to deal with that narcissist still, and they can go off, they're going to be doing their thing. They're going to be antagonistic. They're going to say, they're going to blame you for things. But once you've done this healing process, then you're able to say, I hear that person, but I'm not attached to it anymore. Like, I know who I am. Like, they may say this about me, but I know me. And that is the ultimate way to turn off the gaslight.
So true. Trusting yourself, knowing yourself, because when you know that in your heart, if someone's deceiving you or trying to deceive you,
Hmm.
you will see through it because you know from within that you know who you are. You know your heart, you know your mind, you know the things that you think about, you know the things that you care about,
Right.
you know what matters. So, but if you don't know those
Yeah,
things, you're up in the air. If someone tells you you're selfish or you're
exactly.
mean,
And
I
yeah,
what are
what
you
you
gonna do? You're gonna
don't
go,
know
okay.
about yourself is your biggest vulnerability. Because before you know yourself,
Mm.
then you think, oh, maybe I am selfish. Like we talked about, a lot of narcissists will take your healthy self-reflection and use it against you. So you'll be reflecting on something or wondering about how someone is and might make a passing comment like, "Oh, I wonder what was up with so and so today." And the narcissist is like, "Wow, you are so in everybody's business. Why do you make everything about you? You are so analytical and you judge everybody." And that's not your intention at all, but because you are a self-reflective person, you're like, "Huh, well maybe I did do that. Like maybe I was being judgmental. Why am I doing that?" But once you know yourself, then the narcissist doesn't get to speak in your life that way anymore. Like you hear them, but again, you don't attach to it. Like you don't take it personally. So the more you know about you, the less a narcissist can control you, manipulate you, gaslight you, which is why your own healing is so essential to dealing with narcissistic abuse.
I know, and that's why well, definitely gonna have to have you on
Absolutely.
again, Chelsea, because
Yes.
we there's a lot to get through even on part 2 related to, am I being abused? Like, we
Yeah.
talked some of the warning signs, like, I think a big piece is trusting the mental fog piece. If you're consistently questioning, "Am I this? Am I" that's a probably a telltale sign that you're in some sort of unhealthy
Yeah. Something
relationship
is
at the
definitely
least,
off. Yeah.
but potentially toxic. Exactly. But then the trauma bond, reparenting yourself, setting boundaries though. I'm glad that you said that though. I think as a lead way into kind of wrapping the episode, and then I'd love to share how
Hmm.
the audience can connect with you, and if you have a kind of parting message for us. But boundaries, as we're reconnecting with ourselves and then setting boundaries, are the ultimate way to start to break free from
Yeah.
these toxic relationships, aren't
Yeah,
they?
boundaries, and I talk about in my book, like, silent boundaries, which we can talk about more next time, but it's those mental and emotional
Yeah.
boundaries where you're setting them even if no one knows that you are. Like, it's thinking to yourself, "I don't think that. I don't feel that. Like, this is actually what's true for me." And taking back how you feel is the biggest boundary of all.
It really is. I think for me, and because I don't have clients, or so a lot of
Mhm,
this is reflected in my own work that I've done, and the biggest change has been around knowing what I know about myself and the way I treat other people. Is that true or not? And when you
mhm.
have that power, that's why we
You do.
hold the ultimate power, no matter what, because that self knowledge frees us from the deception or the power games that ultimately narcissists play. And to your point, it's often the most self-reflecting, compassionate people
Mhm,
that get caught in these relationships because they're caring, they're reflective, but we're not fully tied and connected to who we are from within because probably had a family life that was similar to this, and we're kind of
mhm.
repeating the process. So until we learn to recognize it, we get caught in these cycles of abuse. And ideally, more people are going to learn about your work. They'll start to free themselves from this abuse cycle, and we can start to shift our society away from such a, because the thing, you even say this in your book, like, once you start seeing it
Yeah.
everywhere,
You
or it
can't
may have been one
unsee
of
it.
the stories in there, you see it everywhere. Yeah. Like, it's crazy. So Chelsea, how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to learn about your work, maybe or potentially work with you?
Yeah.
You do a lot of
Yeah,
great
I offer
stuff.
therapy
So
and coaching. I have my book. If people are really resonating with this conversation, you want to learn more about narcissism, how to communicate with narcissists, how they think, and ultimately how to heal, you can get the first chapter of my book for free, or I also send out a free bi monthly newsletter on all of these things as well. You can get that at chelseybrookecole.com.
Awesome. Well, Chelsey, and I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes for them so they can sign up for your newsletter, get a taste of what you're doing. I'll link to your book too, because it's fantastic. And I'm pretty sure I got it for 99
Yeah.
cents as a Kindle. So that's a killer deal. If you can spend $1 and get this information, you're doing it's tremendous work you've done, Chelsey. So we'll link back to your work there. Is there anything that you'd like to share before we end the show today?
I just there's such a heaviness that comes from, dealing with these topics and people in these relationships. So I just encourage people to, if you resonate with this and you think you may be in a toxic relationship, to start to write things down and notice those patterns and just give yourself the space to look and see what you're dealing with, to see what resonates and what doesn't. I know many survivors are hesitant to look at this because if they see it, then they're afraid, well, what am I going to do? Like, if my spouse, if my mom, if my dad, if my sister is a narcissist, like, I don't even know what to do with that. So I can't even look at it. Decide not to decide. Give yourself the space, see what resonates, see what doesn't, write things down, look for the patterns. And then once you see what you're dealing with, then decide what you want to do. But at least give yourself the gift of knowing what this is so you don't have to blame yourself so much.
That's awesome. Just it doesn't have to be
Yeah.
this big, huge decision, right? Just
Take
just a
one step.
little, just start now. Yeah, that's the best. And honestly, that's how we
Hmm.
do everything in life is one step at a time, one day at a time. So no matter how bad it may be or seem now, just one little step. That's a fantastic message, Chelsey. Well, look, it's been a
Yeah,
great
thank
pleasure to
you.
have you on the show. I really appreciate you coming on. Definitely going to have to get you back on because we only got through, I don't even know if that was halfway through your book because we just started part 2. So there's a lot of great stuff in there. So I certainly appreciate you and your time here, and hopefully the audience enjoyed the nuggets that you shared with us in today's conversation. I'm learning a lot. I selfishly benefited huge from our conversation too. So I feel like I got a little therapy session on the house here. So Chelsey,
Yeah.
I appreciate your time. Look forward to connecting with you in the future. And for the listeners, catch you next time. Thank you for listening to Order Within. If you found the episode helpful, please consider sharing, rating, and subscribing. New episodes will be released every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, y'all.